Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Happy Election Day, if you're in the UK, or even if you're not. For today's episode, not to celebrate today's election, but to try and understand it better, I'm talking to the historian Robert Saunders about the last UK general election. The one in 2019 that saw Boris Johnson return to Downing Street with a thumping majority. We are going to be discussing what happened to get us from then to now and all the twists and turns along the way. How did we get from 2019 to 2024? Robert, the election that we're talking about today happened 4.5 years ago, which isn't that long. And yet it feels to me anyway like a long time ago. I think that's partly because we're on our third Prime Minister, and almost certainly, as of this week, we will be on our fourth Prime Minister in 5 years, which, as we discussed before, is 1920s style British politics. But it's also because between that election and now, there was the COVID pandemic, which was the biggest disruptor of British public life and private life since the Second World War. Does it feel long enough ago to you to be able to talk about it as history, or is it still a bit too raw for that, do you think?
Well, I always prefer things to be about 100 years ago before I talk about them as a historian. So we're pushing things a little bit there. But I think it's quite interesting to look at it through the lens of all of the other elections that we've been discussing over this series. So a few episodes back, we talked about that volcanic period from 1922 to 1924, when Britain had 4 prime ministers, 3 general elections, the destruction of one major party and its replacement by another. And I think there are some parallels here. If we think about that period from 2015 to 2019, we've got 3 prime ministers, 3 general elections, an epoch-shaking referendum. But also beyond that, we've got the destruction and the rebirth of the Liberal Democrats. We've got the SNP landslide in Scotland. We've got the Corbyn revolution in the Labour Party, the emergence of UKIP and the Brexit Party as challengers on the right. So it is, I think, one of those quite rare periods where everything seems possible politically, where the kaleidoscope isn't so much moving as spinning, and no one really knows what the picture is going to look like when things settle. And many of us, I think, in 2019 expected that we had now closed that period of turbulence and that we could now anticipate 10 years of Johnsonian dominance. But as so often, history has some stings in the tail.
Yes, the Johnsonian hegemony has not lasted. It is interesting because it's tempting to think of the last 3 years as the really turbulent period, but it's been turbulence really within one party, the governing party. As you say, 16 to 19 was turbulent for all of the parties. The referendum was the key event, but for our terms, I think, to make sense of 2019, we have to talk about the 2017 general election. I did compare it earlier in a previous podcast to the 1923 election in that run of elections, the one where a Conservative Prime Minister inherited a working majority, Stanley Baldwin, Theresa May, but it wasn't good enough and wanted a popular mandate to take some difficult decisions and called an election, and the public didn't provide that mandate. The public said no. The difference is in 23, the public said no on a sufficient scale that it actually allowed a minority Labour government into office. In 2017, we did come quite close to that. To many people's absolute astonishment, I remember on election night reading a headline that said, if you think Jeremy Corbyn can't be Prime Minister, wake up now. And I did. But it didn't happen. To me, the irony of 2017 is that Theresa May wanted to run it in a way as a single issue election. She wanted to run it as a Get Brexit Done election, though she didn't have a clear idea of what that meant. And the public said no. The public turned it into a pretty conventional domestic policy election. The issues that mattered for people were education and health, and particularly social care. She also turned out to be a very weak campaigner. And so she lost a majority. But ironically, what she then got was a single issue parliament. What was so remarkable about the parliament of 2016 to 2019, particularly towards its end, was how completely dominated it was by Brexit and the impossibility of getting a majority in the Commons for any version of Brexit or any version of not Brexit. I can't think of a parliament like that one. Can you?
No, I think the difference with 1923, of course, is that there hadn't in 1923 been a referendum that instructed Parliament to do the thing which Baldwin had then failed to secure a mandate. And I think if we want to understand the Parliament that ends in the 2019 election, we actually have to think about the 2016 referendum and the 2017 election together, because the combination of those things produces a completely unprecedented constitutional situation. And I think it's unprecedented probably in three main respects. So firstly, ministers after 2017 were trying to do something that simply never happens. They were trying to carry a planet-sized policy change through a parliament in which they had no majority. And British politics is simply not set up to do that. Parties either have big majorities, or if they're operating in a hung parliament, they trim their ambitions and they don't push parliament too far. The referendum made that impossible. They had to try to do Brexit, but they didn't have the numbers to do Brexit. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that the referendum had settled, in a sense, one big policy question, which was whether or not Britain should leave the EU. It had given no instruction at all on the terms on which Britain should leave the EU, or what the future relationship should look like. And that was a question that divided leavers just as much as it divided remainers. So Boris Johnson famously twice voted down Theresa May's withdrawal agreement because he thought that the terms weren't good enough. So there was a mandate to leave the EU, but there wasn't a mandate for any of the doors through which Britain might actually depart. And then the third problem is that from the moment that Article 50 was triggered in 2017, beginning the formal Brexit process, there was a kind of doomsday clock ticking under British politics that was going to go off in 2019. So under Article 50, Britain and the EU had 2 years in which to negotiate an agreement. And if they couldn't do that, and if they didn't agree an extension, then Britain would simply leave automatically on the harshest possible terms. And again, that's unprecedented. Normally, if Parliament can't agree on something, nothing happens. In this case, if Parliament couldn't agree on something, the most radical change would happen. So we've got three dynamics there, producing a Parliament that by 2019 is like something out of Bugsy Malone. It's hysterical, it's exhausted, it doesn't know what to do, and it can't see a way out.
And they're all firing custard pie machine guns at each other. I went through some of the votes. I was looking this morning, trying to remind myself, and it is almost like a sort of academic exercise in what academics call game theory, where you get cycles of votes where you can't engineer a majority for anything. It's almost a version of the paradox of democracy, but it doesn't often happen in practice. So it wasn't just the 3 votes that Theresa May tried to get through the Commons, and on the third one, she even got Boris Johnson to vote for it, but still not enough. And she did it by promising to resign as well. People, I think, forget she'd already said, if you vote through this one, I will stand down. It won't be me who does it. But then you got later on, and including into the Johnson premiership, this series of indicative votes or attempts by backbench MPs or shadow ministers to engineer some consensus from the Commons, and they kept being voted down. It was nightmarish. I think the politicians experienced it as nightmarish. The thing that precipitated Theresa May not just saying she would resign if you let me do this, but actually resigning, ironically, was the European Parliament elections of that year of 2019, when the Conservative Party, I think for the only time in its history in a national election, came 5th, behind even the Greens, as well as the Brexit Party, the forerunner of reform, the Liberal Democrats who came 2nd, Brexit 1st, Labour 3rd. I can remember discussing with politicians, one conversation in particular stands out for me with a Conservative politician who I should say is still in the Commons and is almost certainly going to retain his seat and is being talked about as a future leadership candidate. But discussing with him in the summer of 2019 what he saw as an extinction level event for the Conservative Party. He was talking about the end of the Conservative Party within 6 months. And there was a real whiff of panic. The Conservatives polled 8% in those European elections. Actually, in the party's history, it had never experienced anything like that. There was panic, wasn't there?
There was, and there's panic across the House because, as you say, the Conservatives come 5th with less than 9% of the vote. But that rather disguises the fact that Labour comes 3rd with 13.5% of the vote. So actually, both the major parties are looking into the abyss in the summer of 2019. There is a sense that the whole complexion of British politics might be about to change. And of course, when the other parties are deciding later in 2019 whether or not to give Boris Johnson an election, that also influences their calculations, because the Brexit Party has come first. The Liberal Democrats have come second. The SNP have also done quite well. So there is a sense among smaller parties that there is a chance here to cannibalise the sort of rotting corpses of the big two parties. If you're ever going to break the mould of British politics, this might be the time to do it.
And I remember the Liberal Democrats in particular got a little bit carried away, a little bit hubristic at that moment. So the choice that Conservative Party made was to go with Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson likes to compare himself to Churchill. I don't think the comparison often stands up, but there is a little bit of it around his arrival in Downing Street. As with Churchill in 1940, he was mistrusted by his own party. He didn't have that many friends in his own party. He'd burnt quite a few bridges. He had failed as Foreign Secretary. It felt a little bit like a last roll of the dice, but also, given the central dominating question of British politics in 2019, as in 1940, there was one thing that loomed over everything. He was, for many in the Conservative Party, the only person who could plausibly get them out of this mess. Is it stretching it, that Churchillian comparison? Just for that, I'm not saying, and then ... but just for his arrival in Downing Street, it was an unlikely event, as was Churchill's.
Well, he would certainly enjoy the comparison. But I think that there is a comparison in the scenario, in the sense, as you say, this was a party that didn't trust Johnson, that recognised that his period as Foreign Secretary hadn't been a great success in terms of command of his brief. But there was also somebody here who was popular with the electorate, who had kudos with Leave voters because he had been the central figure of the Leave campaign, and therefore could protect the Conservative Party from the Brexit Party and from Nigel Farage on its flank. But also someone who communicated optimism and cheerfulness at a time when Parliament was absolutely immiserated. I think something that we're in danger of losing when we look back on the Brexit period now is actually just how wretchedly unhappy and exhausted and frightened large numbers of members of Parliament were in that period, when they had rival encampments outside Number 10, when people were fitting bolts and security locks to their doors. And a number of Conservative MPs were physically frightened as well as politically frightened of what would happen if they failed to deliver Brexit. So the fact that you've got a man here who almost has Brexit stamped on his forehead, but also seems to be able to lift the mood of politics, is attractive in a way that it might not have been 2 years earlier or 2 years later.
The decisive choice that he made early on, I think, was to bring Dominic Cummings back into government. Dominic Cummings, who had been the architect of the Vote Leave campaign that had successfully won the referendum. Dominic Cummings, who had previously worked for Michael Gove, but had been, as Johnson had been, out of the fold. He was brought back, and between them, though I think Cummings was the driving force, they came up with a strategy. I think they both recognised that the key thing they needed was another election. This Parliament was broken. It was frozen. That's probably the better way to put it. But to get an election was hard at this period because the Prime Minister did not have the authority Prime Ministers have had subsequently. We were still in the terms of the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which required a 2/3 majority, I think, in the Commons to assent to an election. Now, this was a Parliament that couldn't agree on anything. You know, getting a 2/3 majority for anything was almost impossible. And it wasn't at all clear it was in the interests of the opposition parties to call an election. And yet they did it in 6 months. I still think it's one of the remarkable achievements of recent British politics. They did it. And they did it by essentially goading the opposition into allowing an election. The strategy, I don't know how you would characterize it. I think it was partly, to borrow a phrase from Tony Blair, it was partly a masochism strategy. They just brought on as much opprobrium as they could, including by proroguing Parliament. And I remember Johnson, in that period of his premiership, in various debates in the Commons, just standing up and being subjected to hours of abuse from his own side, from the other side. He was a vandal. He was wrecking the Constitution. He had dishonoured the Queen. And he just stood there and soaked it up. Because I think the goal was to drive them so mad that in the end, they agreed to something which was not in their interests. What do you see the strategy of that period as being?
Yes, I think the strategy was to force an election, but there are two barriers that they had to overcome. One, as you say, was the constitutional barrier, that they had to get over the provisions of the Fixed Term Parliament Act. So they needed opposition parties to vote for this. But the other was a kind of an electoral test. A problem for Theresa May in 2017 was that she hadn't persuaded the public that that election was actually necessary. It's why everyone's favourite moment from the 2017 election is Brenda from Bristol saying, "Another one!" There's just too much politics going on. So there was a recognition that you had to convince the public that an election was the only way out of this, and that an election was necessary because Parliament was obstructing Brexit. So that was the key political challenge. And a big part of that strategy was convincing Parliament that Boris Johnson was willing to leave without a deal. And that was a big shift from Theresa May. Theresa may have said that no deal is better than a bad deal, but nobody actually thought that Theresa May was going to leave without a deal. Boris Johnson clearly was willing to do that. And that meant that Parliament had to actively intervene to stop him. It had to take control of the legislative timetable. It had to impose extensions on the government. So it becomes much easier in that period to say Parliament is exceeding its constitutional functions. Parliament is stopping us leaving. We could have left at the end of October if it wasn't for all of these MPs who are squatting in the House, and only you can clear them out and make Brexit possible.
Do you think the prorogation of Parliament was really political theatre? I remember the day when Baroness Hale, who became a hero to many Remainers, said that it had been illegal. And a lot of people held this up, finally someone has sort of stepped in to rescue us from this nightmare. But of course, it didn't really change anything. Johnson then returned and once again stood up and bore the opprobrium of the House. But on we went. I think Cummings has said subsequently that it was specifically designed to poke the opposition with a stick. They weren't really trying to bypass Parliament. What they were trying to do was to drive the other side mad with frustration and rage.
Yes, it's an act of theatre, but it is a genuinely historic one. I'm principally a constitutional historian, and I still find it astonishing that the waters have closed over this so quickly, that we actually don't talk more about the fact that a Prime Minister without a majority in Parliament tried to suspend Parliament at a crucial political moment. I think that really is an epoch in Britain's constitutional history. But, as you say, the result of that is that it drives people like me mad. And it also communicates to the public that this is a government that really is willing to do anything, whatever it takes, in order to get Brexit done, even if that is trampling over the Constitution and leaving without a deal.
And yet I still think there's a really interesting question, which is why did the opposition in the end allow this election? So another memory I have of this was on my doorstep. My local MP is a Labour MP called Daniel Zeichner, who was canvassing in 2019. And I remember saying to him, why did you guys vote for this election? Because I think you're going to lose. And he said, to his credit, I didn't. And he didn't. He was one of the few who didn't, actually. And he said, it was very clear to me that this was a mistake because we had them. They were trapped. And he, as the representative for Cambridge, one of the most Remain constituencies in the country, thought his job was to do whatever he could to try to prevent Brexit from happening. And you could take whatever view you like about that as an understanding of the responsibilities of a constituency MP. But nonetheless, taking that as the premise, he thought the only way that could be achieved was here was a government that couldn't do anything. And you had to hold them in this trap until, in a sense, they broke the other way. It was a game of bluff. But the people who blinked first were the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. Was it that they were deluded? Did they actually think that they might win? Had they been deceived by what had happened in 2017? Why did they agree to that election?
I think there's a few different things going on. I think it's partly just that Johnson is offering a resolution to a situation that has left MPs exhausted, demoralised, and in many cases frightened. If you're a Leaver, then here is a chance to win a majority and make sure that Brexit happens. If you're a Remainer, you actually have a chance to throw these people out and stop Brexit in its tracks. And if you're just like many MPs, tired and emotionally broken, then there is the prospect of some kind of closure. So I think that's one part of it. I also think, as I said earlier, that The Liberal Democrats and the Scottish Nationalists actually see possibilities here. The Lib Dems think that they can rebuild after the collapse of 2015. The SNP had gone backwards quite dramatically in 2017 and see a chance to take that territory back. And once they've moved, it's quite hard for the Labour Party to say, well, actually, we're frightened of an election because we think we're going to lose. But I also think, and I don't know how much this weighed on the minds of MPs, that an election was actually the constitutionally appropriate thing to do at that time. If you have a parliament that isn't willing to pass the flagship legislation of the government, then either the government or parliament has to change. And once it was clear that parliament was not willing to remove Boris Johnson as it could have done, the only real alternative is to allow him to take his policy to the country. So in some ways, I think the question that hangs over all of this is, why didn't Parliament remove Boris Johnson?
And do you think that's because this isn't the 1920s or the 1870s or those periods in parliamentary history where it wasn't understood that an election was in the end the only way you can resolve these things? Party discipline broke down for the Conservative Party in many respects, but it also held. It was still deeply tribal. There wasn't really a way to reconfigure this parliament, which was divided on so many issues, in order to create a new coalition within parliament to support a new government in a way that might have been possible 100 years or 150 years earlier. Politics didn't work that way anymore. This is one of the ways British politics has changed. We don't have a parliament where you can reconfigure the arithmetic within the House of Commons to create a new administration without a general election.
No, but as we've shown in the years since 2019 and the years before, it is possible for Parliament to change the Prime Minister.
Well, it's possible for the Conservative Party to change the Prime Minister.
I think a key point here, it takes us back to this extraordinary constitutional moment that Britain was in after 2017. So in 2019, Parliament manifestly had no confidence in Boris Johnson. As we've discussed, it was legislating to bind his hands. It was spelling out the terms of letters to the European Commission. It did not trust him to keep his promises to the House of Commons. So constitutionally, it ought to have removed him. The problem was that they had even less confidence in the leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn. Even the most determined Conservative rebels, people like Dominic Cummings, were not willing to put Jeremy Corbyn in power as the price of removing Boris Johnson. And because both parties had handed over the power to choose their leaders to their membership, they can't pick someone else as party leader. So what we get instead is this bizarre situation in which MPs keep Johnson in power, but try to control and constrain him. And that just wasn't politically or constitutionally sustainable.
He had also begun by this point a purge of the party. So there were quite a large number of MPs who had been expelled from the party, who had lost the whip. There were attempts in this period to create a new configuration in British politics, a new politics of, I don't want to call it the centre, because it wasn't clear where the centre was at this point. This election was going to make some pretty clear offers to the electorate, including the Liberal Democrats, who bravely or foolishly, depending on your point of view, went to the country with the pledge of a second referendum. But there were attempts to reconfigure not just the parliamentary arithmetic, but the contours of British party politics. And they now look hopelessly inadequate. Were they always hopelessly inadequate?
Well, I think it is striking in retrospect that if ever there was going to be a situation in modern British politics where you can imagine a new political alignment forming, it would have been 2019. You had probably a majority of Labour MPs who were appalled at their own leadership, and you had large numbers of Conservative MPs aghast at their government. And the fact that so few MPs are willing to jump, and almost no MPs of real eminence were willing to jump, I think says something about the impossibility of operating outside the party system in contemporary British politics. In a way, everyone had learned the lesson of the SDP and the alliance in 1983, that there might be an electoral demand there. You might in 1983 be able to bring real titans out of the Labour Party, but the electoral system is going to punish you. And Labour rebels in particular had learnt the lesson that if you don't like Jeremy Corbyn, you're better off trying to wait him out and rebuild afterwards than moving outside that party and building something different.
Was it also decisive, as you said, that this is now the era where the party membership chooses the leader. So I think it's conceivable to imagine in another era a politician, either Labour or Conservative, who could have, in order to get Brexit done in a way that was acceptable to the House, formed an administration which was a cross-party administration. But though Corbyn had lost the support of most of his MPs, the attempt to get rid of him had failed. They had gone back to the membership and the membership had re-elected him. There was no evidence in 2019 that Johnson was becoming less popular with the membership. So the two parties were trapped in that respect too. And this is a relatively recent development in British politics. After all, when we were talking about those great Labour leadership elections of the 1970s, it was just the MPs who decided it. There was no consultation with the trade unions. There was no consultation with the membership. It was very much who could command the authority of the members of parliament. By this point, the members of parliament didn't count. I mean, with Corbyn, they had made absolutely clear most of them couldn't serve under him. And the membership said, we don't care. That does really constrain the freedom of manoeuvre for people who might want to try and sort of find a way through this nightmare by sort of throwing the dice again and seeing if you come up with a different number in Parliament.
Yes, it's another constitutional milestone that Boris Johnson is the first Prime Minister who is placed in number 10 by a vote of party members. That could have happened with Gordon Brown in 2007, but because he's actually unchallenged, it never goes to that point. But that has never happened before. And that means that he really can't be removed by Conservative MPs without pitting themselves against their own membership. So MPs who don't like Boris Johnson have a kind of choice between surrender and suicide in 2019. If you try and overthrow Johnson, you will be deselected. You will destroy your career as a Conservative politician. So your only option really is to go along with it. And that is a massive and hugely consequential political shift. And whatever the rights and wrongs of this mechanism, when the two parties went over to this system, I don't think either of them were thinking seriously about what would happen in a parliament of this kind. 20 years before, it would have been possible for the Conservatives, if they wished to do so, to put someone like David Lidington in government. That's gone by 2019. That is now off the terrain of the possible.
And nor could the Labour Party have dreamt of, say, putting Hilary Benn. Hilary Benn could conceivably, I don't know how the maths would work, but someone like him could conceivably have constructed a majority in Parliament for a temporary national administration. Not with the Labour members, he couldn't.
Quite. That's another constitutional milestone. In 2016, Labour MPs had overwhelmingly voted no confidence in their leader, and the members had simply put him back again. And not only had they put him back again, they had excoriated MPs for their allegedly anti-democratic conduct in what came to be called a coup against the democratically elected leadership of the party. And Labour MPs were deeply scarred by that. So this is a different political world, and that changes the rules of what is politically possible in a crisis situation like 2019.
So the result is that in December 2019, there is going to be an election. I think it was the first December election for 100 years, since 1918. We've got a July election, which is rare. A December election is even rarer because it's dark and it's cold and canvassing is no fun. And as you said, a lot of MPs were actually quite frightened at this period. They weren't particularly comfortable with their jobs. It's scarier doing it in the dark. It was a pretty bleak time. Nonetheless, the Labour Party had a strong memory of what had happened 2 years earlier. The 2017 election, when it was called, was expected to be the end of Jeremy Corbyn. He was very unpopular in the polls. Theresa May was 20 points ahead. He wasn't a great campaigner. He didn't campaign, I think, particularly well in 2017. She was terrible, so he was not bad by comparison. But over the course of that campaign, the gap was closed to a remarkable degree, to the point where he came quite close, not to winning, but not losing in 2017. Was there a thought in the Labour Party that it could happen again? Because it is also the case that in those 2 years, public opinion about Corbyn had shifted. And I think there was sufficient evidence that it had shifted. He may have been as popular with the members, but he was significantly less popular with the wider public, including with some Labour voters in what came to be known as the Red Wall. And his image had changed. He was a plucky, underdog, lovable granddad in 2017. He wasn't in 2019. I think most people had a much sharper view of who he was. He was a little bit of someone onto whom you could project things in 2017. It was harder to project onto him in 2019, I think.
Right, so this was a period when the impossible had become the everyday, and I think the 2017 election really illustrated that. In 2017, Jeremy Corbyn had utterly defied the pundits, including me, by launching a barnstorming campaign which had clawed back a massive polling deficit and brought the Labour Party to 40%. It energised the Labour movement in a way that hadn't really been seen since 1997. Now, as you say, I don't think that was entirely because of Jeremy Corbyn. It's also about a rallying of the Remain vote. It's also about Theresa May's disastrous handling of the campaign. But I think it would be churlish not to acknowledge his central role in that campaign. And that had upset certainties about what the public would and wouldn't vote for. But I think by the time we get to 2019, he's clearly a colossal drag on the Labour vote. And that's partly because of his own mistakes as a leader. His response to the Salisbury attacks in 2018, for example, had been fairly catastrophic. His failure to get a grip on anti-Semitism in the party did it huge damage, and I think also undermines his own claim to be a kind of moral authority in British politics, which had been so central to his appeal. But it's also because the Brexit debate had changed. In 2017, Labour could still basically say, we will do Brexit, but we'll do it nicely. We will have a jobs-first Brexit. And you don't have to spell out what any of this means, but it's a Brexit that won't be a nasty Tory Brexit. It'll be a nice one. By 2019, that's far in the rear mirror. You're now actually having to make decisions. Do you want to stay in the single market or in the customs union? Do you want to hold a people's vote, as it was called, to ratify any particular agreement? And those are questions that cut across Labour's normal factional divides. So you get the extraordinary phenomenon of someone like Alistair Campbell. Alistair Campbell's former Director of Communications texting John McDonnell, Jeremy Corbyn's number 2, on the front bench in the House of Commons, supplying him with lines to use against Chuka-Ramana. So the Labour Party is in a sort of vortex over Brexit by 2019. Corbyn's own supporters tend to be very Remain, and it's becoming much harder to hold together that strange alliance of a lifelong Eurosceptic in Jeremy Corbyn leading an overwhelmingly Remain party. So throughout the electoral period in 2019, Corbyn's approval ratings, I think, were somewhere between about -39 and -50, which is kind of Liz Truss or Genghis Khan territory.
Almost Rishi Sunak now, not quite, I think. I'd forgotten about Chuka-Ramana. When you said that careers were destroyed in this period, they really were. Quite a significant number of either leading figures or future hopes of these parties end up out of Parliament. Rory Stewart is another. The campaign became a single-issue campaign, the thing that Theresa May had wanted in 2017, but for various reasons she had not been able to achieve, was achieved by Boris Johnson in 2019, Johnson and Cummings. Get Brexit Done, 3 words, were absolutely the central message of the Conservative campaign. I don't think Johnson fought a particularly good campaign. He was pretty weak in debates. He's quite a weak debater. He's a good person to kind of get off a bus and to be mobbed by crowds, but he's actually not a particularly effective orator. But his message was crystal clear. The word is that Dominic Cummings went to all of the potential candidates in the summer of 2019 when Johnson eventually won the leadership. There were 5 of them, and offered his services to each, and to each of them said, it's simple. The message is simple. Defeat Corbyn, unite the country, get Brexit done. You know, any of you can win with that message. That message is unbeatable as long as you can get to an election. And he turned out to be right. We've talked about this a little bit, but can you think of other campaigns that so effectively were turned by the party that won them into single-issue campaigns?
I think the nearest equivalent would be where we started this mini-series, which would be the election of 1900, which becomes known as the khaki election, because khaki is the colour worn by British soldiers in South Africa. And the Conservatives fight this single-issue campaign on supporting the war efforts, and they're blown into office, or back into office, by what Lord Salisbury called as the Jingo Hurricane. And interestingly, of course, they then collapse over the next parliament because that single issue has ceased to apply. I think in 2019, there's perhaps a major theme and a minor theme. So the major theme is Get Brexit Done. The minor theme is do you want Jeremy Corbyn in number 10? And the great genius of Get Brexit Done is that it can appeal to 2 quite different sets of voters. On the one hand, it appeals to Leave voters who really do want Brexit as a positive outcome. But it can also appeal to people who are sick of Brexit and just want this question gone. And one of Boris Johnson's skills in that campaign is that he holds those two things together. So whenever he's asked about the NHS or social care or housing, he always replies, we have to get Brexit done. We have to spatchcock this issue off our backs, and then we can turn to a brighter future and address all sorts of other questions. So in a sense, it's not just about Brexit. It's about Brexit as a gateway to other things.
The comparison with 1900 is interesting as well, because the evidence of focus groups was that over this period, one of the words that came to be associated with Corbyn, which was absolutely not true in 2017, but was true in 2019, was unpatriotic. So patriotism actually became an issue, and Boris Johnson was a more natural politician of the patriotic than Theresa May was. As you say, the Salisbury poisonings, the Skripal poisonings, there seems to be quite a close connection between that event and a significant drop in Corbyn's ratings. And I was struck that in the current Labour manifesto, quite early on, they mentioned the fact that that the current leadership will not allow anything like that to happen again. The Salisbury poisonings are mentioned in the current Labour manifesto. I don't think they're very prominent in most voters' minds, but they are prominent in the minds of the current Labour leadership. They knew exactly how much of a disaster Corbyn's response had been. He effectively said the jury is out when the British public thought we're not having Putin's goons on our soil trying to kill people in places like Salisbury. And it was a fatal misjudgment on Corbyn's part. So it was, unlike, I think, 2017, an election where elements of the Conservative Party could be unabashedly using the language of patriotism. And it was particularly effective in the traditional Labour seats of the north.
Yes, and I think we do need to recognise the Corbyn factor here, whether or not we think it's justified. We've talked about other elections in this series in which there is a great surge of support for the winning party. So in 1979, the Conservatives pick up 3 million more votes than in October 1974. In 1945, Attlee adds 3.5 million votes to their total in 1935. That doesn't happen in this election. The Conservatives add about 300,000 votes to the total they've won in 2017. So for all the comparisons drawn between Theresa May's disastrous campaign and Boris Johnson's triumphant campaign, the number of people who actually go out and vote Conservative is pretty much the same. The real transformation in this election is the cratering of the Labour vote, where Labour drops, I think, 2.6 million votes in 2 years between 2017 and 2019. It crashes from 40% in 2017 to 32% in 2019. And that really is what makes possible the Tory win. And I think the point you made earlier about Boris Johnson as a campaigner is an important one. And it's an example of how stories get told about elections into which individual facts are then inserted. So in 2024, it's now taken for granted that Rishi Sunak is a terrible campaigner. And we can all talk about him coming out and getting soaked in Downing Street, or going on a visit to the Titanic, or building a red wall. And none of these things really matter, but they get built into a narrative about what a terrible campaigner he is. In 2019, Boris Johnson hid in a fridge, pocketed a reporter's phone, badly mishandled floods in Yorkshire, and ran away from an interview with Andrew Neil. But because there was this great story about what a wonderful campaigner Boris Johnson was, and how he was the Heineken candidate who could reach parts of the electorate nobody else could, that never got bound together into a narrative about Boris Johnson as a problematic campaigner.
And to be honest, he also struggled in a head-to-head debate with Jeremy Corbyn, which is quite an achievement too. Another thing that happened during the campaign was the Brexit Party, which has now become the Reform Party and may well be the nemesis of the Conservative Party. Back then, during the campaign, it was decided that their candidates would stand down in seats that were held. I believe were held by Tories so long as those Tories were pro-Brexit, the right kind of Tories. But it did make a difference.
It did. And if there was anything that was going to go wrong for the Conservatives in 2019, it was going to be the challenge from the Brexit Party. In its previous orientation as UKIP, this party had won nearly 4 million votes in 2015. So it had a constituency. It had then collapsed in 2017. Had it reanimated in 2019, that would have made it much more difficult for the Conservatives. I mean, I think they would still have won, but it would have made it more difficult for them to win the kind of majority that they did. But again, it was part of the skill of that Johnson-Cummings strategy that you make this election about, is Brexit going to happen or not? Who do you want to side with? A Remainer parliament determined to destroy it, or a Johnson leadership that will actually deliver it? And that really shrinks the space for a challenge to the Conservative Party's right.
My memory of the night itself is that it was still very uncertain. Because of 2017, people always are fighting the last war or remembering the last war. And on the night of 2017, there was absolute shock and astonishment in Conservative Central Office when the exit poll came through. One description that I read of that evening said there was total silence broken only by the sound of a man vomiting in the back of the room. Whereas there's a great clip of Conservative headquarters on the night of 2019 when the exit poll came out. Conservative Party was staffed mainly by young people. They didn't look like Conservatives. It's just a bunch of young people in the room. And they go absolutely crazy. I mean, it's like a football match. When the exit poll comes through, the room just explodes in joy. Exit polls are now accurate, and it was a big enough win that even if it had been out by a few seats, they knew they had got the job done. So I've got a couple of questions to finish about what came next. So one is this. Dominic Cummings believed that what had won that campaign was not the Conservative Party. He thought that what had won that campaign was he had reconstituted Vote Leave. He had turned the Conservative Party actually into a version of the Vote Leave campaign in the referendum of 2016. And that therefore it was Vote Leave who had won this election, and the Conservative Party would now need to govern as Vote Leave. I don't think Johnson ever thought in those terms. Johnson thought he had won a thumping victory as a Conservative Prime Minister. We now know, it's a bit gossipy, but I think there's some truth in this, that the day after the election, Cummings and his Vote Leave acolytes started talking about how they were going to replace the Prime Minister because he wasn't the ideal candidate for a Vote Leave administration. Is there any sense in which the Conservative Party could have governed as a Vote Leave administration? Among other things, Cummings thought that meant being much more ambitious and radical about what Brexit would have to deliver. Really radical reconstruction of the civil service, really radical devolution. Levelling up would have to mean something much more significant than Johnson ever was willing to give it credit for, but also huge investment in technology, AI, battery technology, R&D, a really vigorous Brexity government. And Cummings knew the morning after the night before that Johnson wasn't up for that. Could it have ever been that way?
I think the alliance between Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings was always a marriage of convenience that had a clock ticking behind it. Dominic Cummings is a genuine radical, whatever you think of him. This is one of the most radical people actually ever in a senior position in a British government, someone who really does want to smash and re-engineer fundamental parts of the British political system. Boris Johnson is not. Boris Johnson is a kind of Bullingdon Club radical. Famously, the Bullingdon Club used to go out, smash up a pub, and then write a cheque to fix it again. Boris Johnson enjoys the sort of theatre of radicalism. He enjoyed the sensation as a journalist of lobbing rocks and smashing things, but there's no real evidence that he actually wants to engineer fundamental change. So you had a partnership that worked for a period, in that what Boris Johnson got was a ruthless political operator who could help him win an election. And what Dominic Cummings got was the chance to turn the guns of the ship of state onto its own decks. But ultimately, it was never very likely to last. And I think one of the ironies here is that Dominic Cummings on Twitter likes to accuse people of not understanding politics. And yet there's a fundamental misunderstanding of politics in what he was trying to do then, because he had no army. Who was it who had the MPs in Parliament? Who was it who had the party machine? It was Boris Johnson. If they fell out, it wasn't going to be Boris Johnson who left office. It was going to be Dominic Cummings.
Although it's also true that within 3 months of the election, 4 months, by March 2020, everything was going to change. And indeed, Cummings and Johnson's relationship was going to go through a different kind of fire, a different kind of test that it would not survive. The COVID pandemic, whatever plans Johnson, Cummings, or any of them might have had for what could have been achieved in that parliament, everything gets put on hold. If Brexit paralysed British government before 2019 in a completely different way, COVID changed everything. It became the absolute central focal point of all the action, not just of the government, but of the British state for actually the best part of 2 years. The Cummings-Johnson relationship broke down not even halfway through that. Cummings became the story. For most people, all they know about Dominic Cummings is that he drove to Barnard Castle and claimed it was to test his eyesight. That's all they know about him. I've tried to sort of tease out some counterfactuals in this series, so I'm going to go for a big one, which is almost impossible to answer. But is there any way of sensing what might have happened absent the COVID pandemic? I mean, was this a government and an administration that was probably going to break down anyway? Its two central figures, Cummings and Johnson, were simply not going to be able to work together. Johnson had an idea of getting Brexit done, but it's not clear he had a particularly well worked out idea of what came next. He was a very optimistic politician, but he was not a detailed politician. Cummings is not the only person who has been absolutely excoriating about his abilities as an administrator, as a manager. That is Johnson. He was hopelessly ill-suited in some ways to the task of Prime Minister. Again, I don't want to do too many Churchill comparisons here, but there's wartime Churchill and there's peacetime Churchill. There's Get Brexit Done Johnson, and then there's all the other Johnsons who aren't up to the job. COVID changed everything. Absent COVID, might we be talking about the election of Boris Johnson's second term now?
It's possible. I mean, Johnson, I think, as a politician, was always more about vibes than he was about policy. I think he did have a broad direction of what he wanted his government to look like. So he wanted Britain to walk tall in the world, although ideally with slightly stooped shoulders like Winston. He was pretty easygoing on social questions. Somebody with Johnson's own appetites is never likely to be puritanical on questions of sex and sexuality. He wanted quite an active state. He was always quite excited about big infrastructure projects, islands that could have airports on them or bridges across the English Channel. He enjoyed wearing high-vis jackets, and he'd never really liked the kind of hair shirt Toryism of the austerity years. So there is potentially a package here, which is a different kind of Toryism and one that might be better suited to a post-Brexit world. But of course, what he never really had was much interest in how you deliver those things or the detail of those policies. And he was always quite reluctant to accept the idea of choices. So you could leave the EU, but still have frictionless trade with the common market. You could cut taxes and have radical programs for expanding social care. And in some respects, his flagship policy really exemplifies that, and that is levelling up. Because levelling up targeted really serious problems. He was absolutely right in the diagnosis that there are large parts of Britain that are appallingly unequal and where the kind of opportunities and outcomes that you might expect in London or much of the south of England simply don't apply. But the very term levelling up suggests a desire to avoid the kinds of dilemmas or the choices that are inherent in something like redistribution or equality. You can simply raise everybody up to the same level. Nobody has to pay, nobody loses out. So it's not difficult for the Treasury to capture that policy and really garrote its ambitions. So you have a kind of direction of travel in 2019, but no map for getting there. And in that sense, this is perhaps the preeminent example in the period we've been covering in this mini-series of a massive electoral dividend, which is largely squandered in the years that follow.
It's also true that the moment where he really thought he had found his grand cause was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. He absolutely felt in his pseudo-Churchillian image of himself that cometh the hour, cometh the man. And I think part of his intense frustration about being turfed out of office that summer was that that moment was taken away from him. We're going to do an episode about the probably pivotal election of 2024 after we know the result. So I'm not going to ask you anything more about what happened between Johnson and now, because we can talk about that then. I think that will be the time to talk about what Liz Truss did to the Conservative Party. So I've got one last question before history joins up with the present. But it is about the current campaign, and it's about one of the things that Keir Starmer has been most uncomfortable trying to answer in this campaign, which is his support for Jeremy Corbyn in 2019. He has been repeatedly asked how he can explain now, because Corbyn has become a kind of pariah figure. He's after all been expelled from the Labour Party. He may well win his seat as an independent in Islington, but Corbyn's position is very different from what it was in 2019. Keir Starmer has been asked repeatedly in debates, in interviews with journalists, to explain himself. He's also been asked a little bit about how he got elected as Labour leader after Corbyn resigned on a Corbyn-ish platform, which now seems quite distant. But the focus has really been on, in 2019, you told people to put that man in Downing Street. How can you justify it? And his answer is he didn't believe that he was going to win. Now, I don't know that anyone was completely certain that Jeremy Corbyn wasn't going to win. It was a very volatile time. But I just wondered what you think of that as a defence.
I think it's an intensely difficult dilemma. What do you do if you're in a party and you are fundamentally out of sympathy with its leadership? And that was true of a certain number of Conservative MPs in 2019 and a very large number of Labour MPs in 2019. You've essentially got two options. Do you walk away, which keeps your hands clean and, absolves you of responsibility for what follows? Or do you try and wait that period out with the prospect of rebuilding the party in future? And I don't think either of those two things are dishonourable courses. But it does speak to the problem that we've touched on already in this episode, that power within parties has moved decisively. And the choice of leader and the choice of prime minister or leader of the opposition now rests with party activists in a way that it didn't do for any of the other elections that we've discussed in this series. That's a massive transformation. And it's bending politics in all sorts of difficult ways. So if you want to become leader of the party now, you have to run a specific election campaign targeted not at the country, targeted not at your party's voters, but targeted at your party's members. When Rishi Sunak was running against Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak made all kinds of promises that I suspect he had no intention of keeping. There's that famous video of him feeding EU laws into a shredder, which is something that he then had to undo when he was Prime Minister. Now, we may not like this. I think in a sense it creates an incentive for candidates for power to say things that they don't believe, to make policy commitments that they don't have to try to wriggle out of. But that is now a structural imperative of the way that our parties are set up.
We've got one more episode in our short series about pivotal UK elections. We're going to be recording it tomorrow. I will be discussing with Robert, probably on very little sleep, what we think just happened. We're going to be trying to make sense of the election of 2024, which we have been assuming and are still assuming is one of the pivotal ones. That will be out in our regular slot on Sunday. If you haven't yet signed up to our newsletter, you can do so very easily just by clicking on the link in the show description. And we have a new newsletter coming out tomorrow, which is going to accompany this series. So it will have links and guides and facts and figures about all of the elections that we've been discussing. But we'll also have some thoughts that we will be writing overnight as the results come in about what we think is happening now. Also, a quick reminder that today is the publication of my new book. It's called The History of Ideas. It is based on an earlier iteration of this podcast, I hope, that if you like this podcast, you'll enjoy that book too. It's about the history of ideas from Rousseau till nearly the present. It's written in the style of this podcast, and you can get it wherever you get your books. And if you would like to get the bonus episode to accompany this series about the election of 1924, but also all of our future bonus episodes and our past bonus episodes too, and ad-free listening, just sign up to PPF Plus. Click on the link in the show description or go to ppfideas.com. See you on the other side of the election. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.